My guest at this time is Ethan Blevins. He's an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. As wildfires rage in northern and southern California, California Governor Jerry Brown and many others are blaming the fires on climate change and are urging instant action at the state, federal, and even international levels. Mr. Blevins and others suggest there is a culprit quite a bit closer to home: government policies at the federal and state levels that forbid efforts to reduce fire danger and even punish citizens trying to help. And Ethan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
Well, you're involved with the case right now with a veteran, a Navy veteran from Montana, so not technically in California, but sometimes the arid conditions are pretty similar up there, and fire is certainly a danger, who was trying to take steps to protect his property and make sure that the fires, if there was one near his home, didn't get out of control to the best of his ability. So explain what he did and what the government did to him.
Sure. So Joe Robertson and his wife live on kind of an alpine hillside, far away from any town. They're pretty isolated, and Joe has worked in the sort of wildfire world for a long time, providing support trucks and so forth. And he lives in an area prone to wildfires. So to protect his property, he dug out several ponds in sort of the stream of this very tiny mountain trickle that comes down from the watershed just about 2,000 feet above him. So he dug out these ponds so that he would have water on hand should something happen. Federal law enforcement shows up and says, well, this little trickle of water that's, about the combined force of, 2 or 3 garden hoses, that's a navigable water under the Clean Water Act. And by digging out these ponds, you've discharged pollutants into the stream in the form of soil and rocks and so forth. So you violated the Clean Water Act. And Joe spent 18 months in federal prison for that and is still paying off a $130,000 fine while he takes this case to Supreme Court.
And so where are you coming in here, and what's your argument in retaliation?
Sure. So we are representing, Pacific Legal Foundation is representing Joe before the United States Supreme Court. So we've filed a petition requesting the court to decide basically the issue of whether or not the Clean Water Act is so vague that it violates due process, because nobody understands how far the Clean Water Act reaches. Nobody understands what a navigable water is, which is what the Clean Water Act regulates. If it's a little trickle coming down from a mountain hillside, then virtually any water in the United States, or even sometimes dry land, could be considered a navigable water, subject to these very onerous federal regulations that could land you in prison, that could saddle you with these heavy fines. And so we think it's unconstitutionally vague, or at minimum, the Supreme Court really needs to provide some really clear guidance on what the Clean Water Act requires of people.
We're talking with Ethan Blevins, an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. And Ethan, whether it's this case or other cases, one of the things that folks who are frustrated by federal policy keep saying to me is that the argument from environmentalists and from bureaucrats and state politicians, or even federal bureaucrats, is that what they want to see is nature just doing what it would do naturally, and so that's the best policy. Folks more on your side of this debate suggest that that's only inviting disasters like we're seeing in California and what we could see in places like Montana as well.
Oh, that's right. Certainly the Forest Service, for example, doesn't engage in thinning and other practices that could really seriously reduce the risk of wildfire because of various environmental policies, various environmental lobbying that pressures them to avoid those kinds of things. So, we see wildfire all across the country, and it's in large part because the federal government's failing to properly manage its own land.
So what's the solution here?
Well, the best solution is to allow private landowners and state and local government to manage their land in such a way as to protect themselves. So Joe should be able to dig his ponds. He's not a threat to the environment by digging those ponds. And local and state governments are often unable to take the kinds of actions they need to, either because the federal government owns too much land, which it is not managing properly, or because of various federal regulations that prevent them from managing it in the way that they would wish. So really, part of the problem with federal regulation, or the rhetoric we hear, is that if we don't have the federal EPA and the various statutes and regulations that they enforce, then the only other alternative is just sort of this dystopian environmental nightmare. When in fact, state and local government have proven time and again that they're good stewards of land, just like the federal government is. And not only that, but private landowners are often very good stewards of the land. And we should not be making them our enemies. Instead, we should be encouraging them to use their land in a responsible way.
And finally, Ethan, I don't know how often you get in the practice of predicting the outcome of your own cases, but I know that the retired Justice Kennedy gave a pretty broad definition to the water rule that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, and your client, Joe Robertson. So when do we get to the next level of this case, and how do you expect this realistically to come out?
Sure. So we just filed the petition to the Supreme Court the other day. The government will have a chance to respond to that, and so there'll be a little bit of back and forth. Hopefully towards the beginning of next year, it'll come to the court in conference, and they'll decide whether or not to grant it. As you say, we don't have Justice Kennedy on the court, and he was, unfortunately, the source of a lot of the confusion that has been going on regarding what the Clean Water Act really means because of a case called Rapanos versus United States. Strangely enough, he wrote a solo opinion in that case that the government relies on, even though it was just him writing, that basically gives the government carte blanche to regulate, dry arroyos in the desert or prairie potholes or Alaskan permafrost and call them navigable waters. That's because of Justice Kennedy's very broad notion of what waters in the United States are, which is basically anything with, quote unquote, a significant nexus to a navigable water, which, as you might imagine, is really squishy language that regulators love and have used to their benefit. So now we have a chance to say, hey, look, at the legacy of Rapanos has just been regulation gone amok, and we need clarification. I think we have the votes of members of the court who'd be interested in that. Justice Alito, Justice Thomas, Justice Roberts have all expressed concern about the Clean Water Act's vague and overbroad reach. And I'm sure Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch would also be on board with that.
We'll be watching. Ethan, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Greg.
Absolutely. Ethan Blevins, an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.